So welcome back to Everything Marketplaces, where we talk with founders and leaders on some of today's top marketplaces. So this is episode 69, which is a really great group chat that we just had with Varun Khona, who's the CEO of Headout. So Headout is an on-demand marketplace for travelers to discover and book last-minute tours, activities, events, and local experiences in over 50 cities. They just announced their latest $12 million funding round last week from some top investors like Version 1 Ventures, FJ Labs, and Haystack. So this is a really great group chat that we had with Varun, where we got to dive into Headout as a marketplace, learn some of the unique aspects of it, what he's learned throughout his journey scaling it, and also had a really great group Q&A for those that were on the chat. So I really enjoyed the conversation, and I know you're going to find it a great watch until the end. So Varun, welcome to the group chat. And it's definitely great to have you join us here today. So big congrats on the recent funding round that you announced last week. And I'm excited to dive into it and learn all about Headout as a marketplace. Before we do, though, I think it'd be great if you could start off by sharing a little bit more on your background for those that don't know you.
Hey, thank you for having me. Been following you guys for a while now, and it's good to be here. The story sort of begins when I finished college. I joined Goldman, and I was in investment banking for a bit. And that sucked the life out of me, for the lack of a better word. And that's kind of when I decided that I want to do something on my own. I started my first venture, which was called Trippy. And the idea there was, how do we get people who are solo travelers to come together as a group and essentially bid on a certain travel experience or a package. And with the availability of a group, we could then potentially get discounts and help people sort of travel more. I ran that for about 2 years as a solo founder, and that was kind of like my initiation or trial by fire into all things travel. Loved the experience. The company did well for itself, but it didn't quite scale in the typical online sense. The marketplace was largely offline, and I just wanted to do something that was a little bit more fun. And that's kind of where Headout just took shape with Suren, who's my co-founder. I had known him for about 7 years then. We studied in college together and always wanted to sort of do something just the both of us. And that's kind of how the journey got started. But I've got a very typical background, investment banking, tried a startup, failed, tried another one, and we're still at it.
That's great. So kind of going back to the early days, what were like the first steps that you took to start Headout as a marketplace? And then maybe some of the kind of initial challenges that you faced.
That's a long story. Okay, let me try and talk about the ones that were really interesting. So I think what's extremely unconventional about our story is that we decided to sort of launch Headout in the US, even though both my co-founder and I don't come from the States. We have not lived there. We've not studied there. We literally, I came to the States for the first time after we had incorporated Headout, right? So we did something that was batshit crazy, and I don't recommend it to most of the people, but we just felt like there was a huge market for last minute experiences, and it was in the West, not in India where we were. And we just felt like we had to sort of go West and try and figure it out from there. So the first sort of crazy thing that happened was going to a new country and trying to sort of launch something from scratch there, seeding the supply side of the equation. How do you get suppliers? We didn't have a network, etc. So I think that entire process of how we got ourselves embedded into the ecosystem was a really interesting one. It was just a ton of cold calling, persistent emailing, sending notes with invites on LinkedIn. I used to sort of sit down and reach out to, on an average, about 60 to 65 potential supply side partners every single day. And I did that for almost 3 months, every single day of the week, including weekends. And then I used to sort of be the guy that was also sort of on customer calls. And that's kind of like my routine for about 18 hours a day for the first 3 months. So I think what was really interesting for us in the very beginning was that we realized that when we were chatting with these mom and pop shop owners who were selling experiences, they didn't care so much about the fact that we aren't from here or that we don't know America as a market. What they really sort of cared about is that they have a ton of unsold inventory that's lying with them. which is going, which is going for waste. And they would love to be able to figure out a way to get as many people through the door and increase their occupancy rate. But they don't have a technical bent of mind. They don't know how to sell this well online, especially sort of real time at the last minute for today, tomorrow. And they didn't know how to do this on mobile. And so they wanted us to figure it out for them, but they just could not, for the love of their life, sort of figure out a way to give us live access to inventory. And so I think the most interesting thing that we did in the early days of Headout, which to some extent even continues to this date, is we actually wrote custom piece of software to be able to scrape the Excel sheets and Google Sheets and whatever other local systems that these guys were using to be able to have access to their real-time inventory status so that we can then pass that information to our systems and then allow consumers to be able to see what's available and then be able to book them for the next half an hour, the next couple of hours, and so on and so forth. So I think just the sheer amount of hustle in being able to say that, listen, the primary problem statement is that they want to do this, but they just don't have the technical sophistication or the bandwidth or the money to be able to pay for a service, where they have APIs that can talk to the world, and so on and so forth. Instead of waiting for them to get there, why don't we just work with the solutions that they have? They use Excel, they use Sheets, they use some local ERP. We're just going to write software that will scrape their front end, that will scrape their screens and get that information into our systems, process them, and have that available. I think was a huge move in the right direction, which we kind of stumbled upon in the first few weeks of trying, after having like incessant conversations with some of these guys and trying to sort of fix them. So interesting days, was a lot of hard work, but I guess we wouldn't have it any other way, because it sort of really gave us a good insight into always solving for supply side problem statements first. And that almost always leads to whatever solutions that you want on the demand side. If you have a great sort of product, if you have a great supply, then demand will come to you. But that's kind of where the meat of the action lies. And that's kind of the big takeaway that we had from the first, I would say, 9 to 12 months of Headout.
Awesome. There's a lot we want to jump into with that. I think before we do though, it might be helpful if you could give us a kind of high level overview of Headout as a marketplace and maybe even touch on some unique aspects of it for context.
Yeah, for sure. So at the very core of what we do, we're all about inspiring and providing access to people to go and indulge in real life experiences. The name Headout literally comes from what we're trying to achieve, which is to get people to head out and see the world, see the sights in it, meet people, do new things. And if we're able to sort of do this enough in a way where we're inspiring people to do this more often than not, then hopefully in the next decade or so, people will start looking at the idea of going out and indulging in a real life experience as a utility versus sort of an indulgence or a luxury, which is sort of what it's looked at as today. So that's the reason of why we do what we do, right? In terms of our approach or our model, we're a managed marketplace. What that essentially means is that we don't just work with any and every sort of experience provider out there. We curate them heavily. We sit down with them. We look at their entire portfolio of experiences and we create new experiences with them, including experiences which are designed by our experts in terms of what they contain, at what time they run, at what price points do they sort of offer their services, and so on and so forth. So we do a lot of the legwork in the actual creation and designing of the core experience. We then provide them our entire software where they're able to give us real-time access to inventory, guide timetables, dynamic pricing, and whatnot. And we do all of this for free for them in terms of the software. And once all of this is done, we get them to pass our QC layer where we heavily audit and invest time and effort, and in some cases money as well, in upgrading their services. And after we have done all of this back-end work, we then bring them live to the platform, and we then sort of keep working with them very closely to keep it trading and ensuring that the end experience remains consistently standardized and of a high pedigree, right? So think of us in some sense as what a Hilton does with a property owner, where there is a property owner who has an asset, But Hilton then sort of comes in and sets the standards, sets the processes, gives them technology, gives them the entire know-how of how to run that hotel. We do exactly that, but for experience providers, and we do this in about 50 cities right now all over the world.
That's super interesting. So you did mention, aggregating and kind of curating the supply. So was that always your approach from the beginning?
No, so it wasn't, right. For the first 18 months of Headout, we were operating as a pure play aggregator, which was that we had an open marketplace. Anybody could come in and list. There was a very basic vetting process in the middle, but it essentially was a traditional marketplace in the truest sense of the word. And so the end result of it was essentially that if you were looking at getting a tour of a certain neighborhood in Paris, we would at that point in time have tens and tens of sort of providers who would each provide maybe a couple of experiences. And so for a single type of experience, we would have about 40 to 50 SKUs available on Headout, right? What we realized when we were trying to sort of figure out why exactly aren't we hitting what the traditional sort of definition of product market fit is, and the way that we were trying to define that is how do we get conversions on the traffic that we have in a way that pays for itself, right? And why is it that we're not able to get that? And I think what was very clear to us in those conversations when we started digging down was the fact that customers were using Headout for booking experiences for today and tomorrow. They were doing this on mobile. However, when they were coming to Headout, they were, for the same experience they were looking for, were having to browse through multitudes of SKUs. The difference between one SKU versus the second versus third was difficult to comprehend because experiences is a nebulous term, and what exactly it means can differ from provider to provider. Then having to go inside the experience to find out what is it that's available at what price point, and then having to do the comparison across multiple experiences in terms of price, availability, quality was a very difficult proposition, especially on a mobile device. So the big epiphany for us was essentially the fact that on mobile, everybody keeps talking about less is more. The real rendition for that in our world was the fact that we needed to have lesser supply, right? We need to have lesser SKUs, and we needed to ensure that the SKUs that we have are solving for the core problem statements that customers have. Are they getting an experience that's high quality? Are they getting an experience that's just right for what they're looking for? Are they getting it at the right price point? And are they getting it at a time where it's actually available, where they can actually make a booking? And are they getting it in a format where they can go and access the experience on their mobile device without having to call to confirm or having to print your tickets and so on and so forth? So I think when we kind of figured that this was the core problem statement, we moved from being a traditional aggregator to a managed marketplace. And that was that switch that just made everything work. And we haven't looked back since then. And we are happier for that change that we made.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it sounds like you really had to kind of standardize, right? As far as
Yeah.
like the user experience. And I'm sure that was quite challenging across, multiple kind of categories, markets, and even kind of industries. So could you maybe share more about that and like your approach initially, standardizing?
Yeah. So the first attempt that we did in standardization was to assume that we need to bring all experiences to the same standard level. We realized in about a quarter that that doesn't make sense for us because at the end of the day, Headout is providing real life experiences, but it's not the same industry. We're essentially sitting on top of a variety of different industries that are clubbed together. So the way that a museum works versus the way that a walking tour operates versus the way that a bus experience operates versus the way that an activity operates is not the same, right? And so we then sort of went back to the drawing board and created standards that we were ascribing to each specific category of experiences that we related to. And we said, this is the standard for this cohort of experiences, and everybody needs to be able to match with this. For example, when it comes to a walking tour, we said that every walking tour in Headout will have to be for at least 90 minutes. It will have to be a walking tour where people have access to free Wi-Fi hotspots, where the guide will be equipped to take professional photographs of the people who are actually in that tour. It will need to have availability for the next 24 hours at any point in time. And it will have to have guides which are trained and vetted by our experienced team, right? So these were the basic standards that we sort of put in place on day one, and then we kept iterating and we kept adding to these list of standards that we had. So I think the challenge for us was realizing the fact that we're not operating in a singular industry, but a collection of them, and then to be able to figure out what's the right standard for each one of them, I think was difficult. Having said all of this, we also realized that trying to be perfect on day one was a very difficult and probably a foolish thing to try. And so it was much better for us to sort of go with something that we felt was a decent base to start with. And then with managed, right, you always have the ability to go back to your supply and tinker and tweak with it the way that you want. So the idea then was that, hey, listen, can we just have a really high velocity of iteration? And then we changed our process, our playbook, to just allow us that high velocity of iteration, because it didn't matter what we defined as standards today. We knew that we kept changing and evolving that as we sort of went along. And so then from there on, it was all about the operational playbooks and the technical integrations that we had between us and the supplier to be able to do whatever changes we want to do at any point in time.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing more with us on that. Yeah. So there are also too, are there any kind of maybe unique challenges with last minute bookings, such as like availability or whatnot?
Yeah. So availability was like a huge challenge, as you would imagine, right? They just don't have systems that we can talk to in a way that makes sense. And so, as I mentioned, one of the first things that we did was that, and this is something that, Paul Graham sort of talks about, do things that don't scale. This was the definition where we, literally kind of pushed this specific axiom to its limit. When we were working with these operators, they were using systems, everything from an Excel sheet to a Google sheet to a local ERP to a Trello and whatnot. And so they just could not get the time to be able to use our software to give us that inventory, right? And they were just like, hey, listen, this is what we use. Can you figure out a way to get this on your own? Because we just cannot do this, right? And so we literally had to build these weird hacks, if I may call it that, to scrape whatever information resides on their local system, get that onto Headout, and then make it available with us, to the extent where we've done things like we used to sort of set up automated phone calls to these guys at a specific time, and they had to just, using IVR, tell us the number of seats that they have left for a certain experience. So the IVR would be like, just press the number of seats that you have left for the experience that is departing in the next 24 hours. And they used to just type 1, 2, and we used to now see that, okay, they have 12 seats left, and we used to update that on our backend. So I think we just essentially realized that having real-time inventory is what the game is all about. And it didn't matter that they don't have systems that we can speak with, or they didn't want to use our systems because they found that to be too cumbersome, because it's just one guy or one girl running this entire operation themselves, and they just don't have the time or the bandwidth to do so. And so from there on, it was just about how do we create value for them without asking them to do the legwork for us. And so let's build these scrapers. Let's build automated SMS systems and phone calls where we're able to get these information from them. And let's do whatever it takes to be able to get this information. It doesn't matter how unscalable that is. Let's just get it. And once we're able to create enough value for them, we can then get them to transition to using our software. But we need to be able to prove to them that working with Headout would mean that there is a sizable increase in your occupancy rates, which means there's a sizable increase in your revenue, which means there's more money for you to take home as a business and as a business owner, right? So doing this was the pathway to getting them to get integrated into the entire ecosystem of our products. But nothing would have worked if we didn't do the insane level of hacks that we did to get access to this real-time inventory.
Yeah, that's a really great example of doing things that don't scale. And I think most of us here can relate with doing similar with our marketplaces for sure. So, out of curiosity, how many markets do you operate in? And, in the past, what's been your kind of playbook, I guess we could say, for expanding into new markets?
Yeah, so we currently operate in 50 cities. This is spread between North America, Europe, and Asia. In terms of our playbook, the first 10 markets were not very intelligently thought out. We kind of did a spray and pray because we didn't know what would work and what wouldn't. So we were not very methodical about it. But I think after we sort of moved from the traditional aggregator play to like a managed play, we realized that we now have a playbook and we now know the exact systems or mechanism that we had to put in place in terms of how do we first acquire supply, how do we standardize that supply, upgrade it, how do we then have it available on Headout, and how do we start to get demand, and how do we sort of match that demand and supply in a way that makes sense, gives us the kind of economics that we need, and then scale from there. So we figured this out, and that gave us a good template for the kind of markets we need to be launching. Our simple playbook was, one, the market needed to be such that there is a tremendous amount of experiences in terms of sheer volume. So there is, and the way that you would sort of want to get that is we used to scrape TripAdvisor and Google to get the number of listings of experiences or providers of experiences in that city, right? And then we were scraping TripAdvisor and Google again for the ratings, for the aggregate ratings of all of the experiences in that city. And so a city with a lot of experiences with low rating was essentially what we would call our target city. This was further laced with that city should have a geographical proximity to one of our existing cities. Because if we are currently in Rome, it makes more sense for us to launch Naples than it would to sort of launch Amsterdam, because there's a higher chance of overlap of both supply and demand for concurrent markets. So I think it was based on these two vectors. One is proximity, and the second is a lot of volumes, but low NPS or low ratings. And a combination of these two is essentially sort of what dictated where we go, where we go next. Starting 2019, though, we scaled to an extent where we had multiple teams. And so from there on, we could take parallel stabs. So we were expanding in parallel in Asia, in Europe, and North America. Before that, we were doing one city at a time. But now we have sort of got to a stage where we have the team and the resources to be able to do multiple markets at the same time.
That's really interesting. It's probably going to lead to some questions here in the Q&A here in a little bit. I'm also curious to know, as a managed marketplace, kind of how do you set pricing and then also monetize?
Yeah. So pricing is an interesting one because it's still not a solved problem statement, right? We essentially are deciding what the experience should look like, which includes deciding what it should have and what it shouldn't have. And then deciding what the appetite is there for user to pay and trying to sort of figure out the right, I would say optimum price point. Now, the first thing that we realize is it's impossible to be able to figure out the right price point on day one. And so we kind of go bottom up. We go with a number where we sort of figure out all our costs, both the supplier costs, our costs. We want to sort of ensure that we at least have 20% margin as a marketplace to be able to sort of function and provide the kind of quality of service that we want to provide. And we do that bottom-up math and we go with a number, right? And then we do two things. One, we are testing the elasticity of demand against that number. So we keep changing the number on a dynamic basis, literally every single hour, right? And we're checking the elasticity of demand, not just against that number, but also in terms of the cohort of that demand. So we're looking at, are people coming from these countries willing to pay this much amount for this experience? What languages do they speak? Which device are they on, right? And because we are managed marketplace and because we have control of that end price point, we now have invested enough time and money to be able to sort of build systems where this sort of iteration of price is automated, and the system sort of does this, optimizes for what it finds to be the right price point and keeps changing it. This is also, of course, subject to supply, right? And there are two interesting things that happen on the supply side. First one is the amount of unused capacity that there is. If we have a lot of capacity that is unused, then we of course sort of lower our price and then we keep increasing it as we get closer to the fill rate. What was also interesting that we figured out was that when we have multiple suppliers on the back end for the same SKU, right? Because we're now sort of creating our own experience and standardizing it, we can have more than one provider for that exact same SKU or for that exact same experience. And there is now an inherent incentive. If there are, let's say, 5 providers for a single SKU, the provider that's giving us the highest take rate at the highest average rating with the lowest price point is the provider that we would channel the booking to, right? And so there was this interesting play where our algo was optimizing price, looking at customer elasticity. Our algo was optimizing price based on availability. And then we had this whole supply side equation where we had multiple suppliers and they were competing against each other by looking at what's the best thing that they can do to be able to get sales to themselves. And so it was this trifecta of availability, customer elasticity, and supply side competition to be able to get to the right price point. We also sort of figured that we don't have a single price point for an experience. And so we kind of play in a band. We have a floor and a ceiling, and we just let the algo optimize between that range, depending on these 3 variables that we sort of keep optimizing for at all points in time.
So, I'm interested to learn more about, how Headout has kind of evolved as a marketplace, over the course of time. And I'm sure, COVID has definitely impacted it, right?
Yeah. So COVID was interesting to say none the least, right? I mean, we literally went from doing about close to 35 million a month in the month before COVID sort of really became globally widespread and tanked very quickly to zero. And literally there were days where we did zero in sales because the entire world was shut and experiences get impacted directly because we rely on public venues and public sites in cities. And so all of them were shut, and so we were shut. So it was quite dramatic to say the least in every way possible. But here's kind of where we see things are today. One, COVID has, in a rather ironic way, provided 2 huge tailwinds to us. The first tailwind is from a consumer demand perspective. Before COVID, a good chunk, I would say the majority of our customers were international tourists. Today, it's 95% plus domestic tourists plus locals. And we have been able to, in cities which are open with limited restrictions, we have been able to scale back to pre-COVID levels, which essentially now tells us that we have now been able to crack the code for domestic and local consumption. And when the world opens up again with international tourism, we already know how to work that market. And so now we feel like we would be able to, zoom high, back up very, very quickly, which we already have seen in the last 8 months. And the last 8 months, our sales have sort of grown about close to 8.5 times. And we're very close to getting the kind of KPIs that we had imagined we would hit in middle of 2022. We've already sort of crossed that today. So the uptick in demand and the reversal of demand has been extremely sharp, which is amazing. The second thing that it's done is because of regulatory concerns in terms of having time slots, having no contact visits, so on and so forth, the amount of incentive on the supply side to ensure that they are using technology to be able to provide their services online has gone up significantly, right? Before COVID, roughly only about 14% of total experiences were being sold online. The remaining, 86% plus was being sold offline at the venue, phone calls, emails, and so on and so forth. That number has flipped itself on the head. And so the end supplier today has no option but to digitize themselves. And so in a sense, we have kind of been pushed ahead as a marketplace by almost a decade in terms of the desire and the willingness from the supply side to be able to sort of want to work with online marketplaces and bring their experiences online. So, I mean, I kind of find myself in a position where I think that it's provided us with the kind of momentum that is hard to imagine today. And this momentum should sustain itself for at least half a decade, if not more. And so I kind of keep talking to entrepreneurs in the ecosystem where we all sort of talk about the fact that there genuinely has never been a better time to build something in travel/experiences than there is today. So I think for us, from an evolutionary standpoint, this was a huge inflection, starting with a very negative downward spiral. But the last 8 months have just been a huge learning and a huge revelation in terms of how we have seen supply shape up, how we have seen demand shape up, how we've seen our economics improve, and what the recovery sort of trajectory looks like. So I'm excited about what the next 5 years look like. I think it's going to be a lot of work, and I think anybody who's building anything in this space today should consider themselves extremely lucky to be doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And there's never been a better time. And I believe we have a few here in the travel space that are on the chat. So I'm sure they'll jump on here in a little bit. So you did share in the recent TechCrunch article, which covered your recent raise, which big congrats on that, by the way. You shared plans to hire 150. So I learned a little bit, would love to learn a little bit more about, maybe your team size now, the kind of org structure and, your plans with scaling the team up.
Yeah, so we're currently a team of about 100 at this point. And what we essentially figured as a process during this fundraise itself, when we were sort of figuring out our financials, projections, and so on and so forth, we became positive on a unit economics basis in 2019. COVID happened, we went in the black again, but we sort of got back to profitability on a contribution margin basis at a unit level sometime in March this year. Since then, with the growth that we have seen and with the improvement in our fundamental economics, we got to EBITDA profitability in June, right? And what was clear to us was that as we scale, it is impossible for us to lose money, right? Our economics are strong, our conversions are very, very high. And as we add more markets and as we add more experiences, the scale that we keep adding to the ecosystem will only improve the economics and will only ensure that we're doing well as a company. So I think the real realization then was that the only constraint to what I would call our next phase of growth is the people that we have and the work that they are able to do in terms of improving our current experiences and in terms of launching new experiences. So it was clear to us that we needed to just invest all our time, money, and effort in hiring the best group of people that we can and letting them run with it. Because at this point, we've been able to sort of, get the right business model, perfect the entire system, have all the mechanisms in place, have the playbook in place. And so really now it's just about replicating this at the fastest possible pace and making sure that Headout is available in every nook and corner around the world. So I think that's kind of the motivation behind why we feel like we really have to solve the people problem and ensure that we have the team that is equipped to be able to achieve the kind of scale that we want to achieve. And in that context, we're looking for sort of, at least more than doubling the team that we have right now. In terms of org structure, we're very, very simple. We like to not reinvent the wheel in anything that's not our core business. We feel like everything that's not a core premise of what we offer is something that we would just replicate what is considered best practice and iterate from there. So we have a very simple, flat structure, very limited layers. And we have just tried, we have tried very, very hard to do one thing, which is to have a very written or writing oriented culture. So we all live on Slack and Google Docs and Notion now pretty much 24/7. And everything that we do is documented, and everything that we want to do from here on is something that we rely a lot on the written word that we have. So I think that has helped us transition to remote slightly more seamlessly than I would have imagined. And that's also what's kind of like giving us the confidence that we need to be able to say, hey, listen, we can hire these 150 people, even though they are going to be spread all over the world. We have the tools and the systems in place to be able to effectively onboard them, embed them into what we do, get them to soak our culture and then sort of replicate. So I think we feel confident in doing this, but it's scary to think about what that means, because as a founder, one of the least interesting things about my job is the people management work that you have to do, right? As a founder, you would love to solve problems, you would love to code, you would love to figure out what exactly is that specific issue and how to sort of resolve it. But trying to manage people and their aspirations and their careers, etc., was not what most of us were excited about when we started working on whatever problems that we worked on. So I think it's interesting to imagine a world where most of my time would go in that direction. But I have realized that as you grow and as you evolve, what the company needs and what you need to do as a founder also evolves. And I think this is a part of that journey for us. So I don't know how it's going to pan out, but fingers crossed, we do what we're supposed to do, and we stumble lesser than what we did the last time.
That's quite the scaling the headcount for the team. So we might have to have you back on as a follow-up in a little while and get some tips on hiring remotely.
Love to.
Awesome. Well, cool. So on that note too, you definitely have some top investors, FJ Labs and Version 1 Ventures and whatnot that are actually part of the community. So, could you share a little bit more about, what the fundraising journey has been like?
The fundraising journey for this round was very different than the previous rounds. Previous rounds were all very simple rounds, happened in 2 to 6 weeks, had a lot of interest because we had good metrics and good growth and so on and so forth. So it's easy to raise when you're doing well, right? I think the round that we did right now was definitely the most difficult in terms of trying to figure out the right fit and the structure and so on and so forth. I think for me, when I zoom out and look at the entire process of fundraising, I realize that I've always obsessed a bit too much on people who have said no to me, which has been the absolute incorrect thing to do. You only need a couple of people to say yes, and it doesn't matter if you've got 98 of them who have said no. You just need 2 yeses and everything else can roll from there. And so that's kind of like the big change that we did in this round. When we started the process in the first couple of weeks, I could not get a term sheet. And I was very disappointed because that has always happened in the previous 2 raises that I'd done. But it was a quick reminder that travel is not the most exciting space to be in today, or at least a couple of months ago. And the story in terms of the certainty that they need, especially in the wake of Delta variant and on and off restrictions and whatnot, is a difficult one for obvious reasons. But I think the revelation was that, hey, listen, we don't need to worry about people who are saying that they're not sure about travel, because of course, if they're not sure about travel, then they will not invest in Headout. So we changed the approach and we specifically sort of went to investors saying, hey, listen, do you have a bullish thesis on what travel could look like in the next 5 years? And are you willing to make a commitment to the ecosystem, right? And if the answer is yes, then we would love to sit down and chat with you. But if the answer is that you're not sure, then it's almost impossible for me to get you from a no or a maybe to a yes. So I think optimizing at the top of the funnel for people who are saying, hey, listen, I have a very clear, bullish thesis on travel. And it's a question of whether you are the right company or not for the space. But I do believe that the ecosystem at large will get to where it needs to get to, right? And I'm extremely excited about what the potential looks like. So I think for us, the big reminder that I would have or the big, I would say, insight I would have for travel founders who are in this conversation and outside would be to specifically get to that first question, which is that, hey, listen, are you open to investing in travel? Are you even, if everything works out, are you even at a position where you can do that? And if the answer is an obvious, strong yes, only then do you go through the process, because otherwise it's just not a good use of their time or your time.
Awesome. That's a really great point. I'm sure that's going to lead to some questions here. And, I feel like you and I could go on for quite some time. So I definitely want to, make sure we can get to some of the group questions. Yeah. So let's just go ahead and jump into those if that sounds good to you. Levi, do you want to jump on?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, Varun, thanks for this. It's been, I loved your energy and love a lot of the points that you're bringing up on here. There's certainly some operational questions that, I'd love to ask, but I think, staying on the topic of fundraising, it's cool to hear, right? Like now you guys are at the Series B stage and really how that sort of changed, right? Where you had started with 500 startups back in 2015. The way that I at least so each Friday, just to give you a little context, I run a fundraising conversation for founders here in this community, right? So it's just ways that we can sort of get together and sort of share like, hey, what are you seeing in market? Like, who are folks that you can
Right.
sort of connect with or things like that. So just, being able to keep that, within the group. And, would love for you to attend, when bandwidth and everything else makes sense. But I think one of the things that you mentioned here is super important, right? Which is like to this point now, you've had, who knows, probably hundreds of conversations, right? Like in multiple rounds of funding, and how you talked about where now the biggest adversity was that, like, hey, before we would have term sheets coming through us that we were saying like no to, right? Or like, and this is one where we had to sort of switch it and be a bit more aggressive. And I love the way that you sort of phrased it, which is sort of the pre-qualifiers, right? Of like, do we see the same future? Because if we can't even get to see the same future, then everything else, like, will be sort of a waste of time and resources and energy. And so I love sort of that framing, because it's something that I've talked about, but I think to hear it directly from you, like you've been doing this shit for, some time now. And so it's just, I think it puts that much more weight into those words, into that process of how you then look into it, right? Of sort of obsessing over the nose. It's like, no, like that was actually the wrong thing, but it only took me, in year sort of 7, to realize that, and so it's easier to sort of say than that. I'd be curious, for folks that are in more difficult industries right now, like travel and others, but that are earlier in their life cycle, right? You guys have, sort of a data room and things like that, and proof of executing that, a long history of that. But for folks that are starting out, what recommendations would you have when it comes to sort of like, attacking the sector today without all of that, prehistoric sort of like data that you have, or that Headout has and sits on today? Thanks.
Yeah. So 2 specific points here. The first one is that if you don't have a lot of data to showcase that you know how to execute the problem statement you're working on, the thing that I would always recommend people to fall back on is painting a very clear picture of what the world looked like before your solution existed, and what will it look like after your solution is in its complete shape and form available to the entire world at large, especially in the context of COVID, right? The world has, in these ecosystems, changed in a very meaningful way. And so if there's a very compelling argument that you can make about why this was being done the way that it was being done before COVID, what has made a specific change that's been induced because of COVID, and how does your solution play well to that change? That change could be a consumer psyche change. That change could be a supply landscape change. That change could be a regulatory change, right? Any of these things, if there's a very clear articulation of the fact that this was the past, this is the current, this is what the future looks like, and here's how we play into the transition, I think you've got a better chance of getting a yes than not. Now, this is obvious, right? However, I think the fundamental mistake that I have seen founders make in early stages, and we were a part of that cohort that made that same mistake, was to not articulate this entire journey into or this thought process into a document. What I recommend now for travel, because it's such a problematic space, for all the reasons that we discussed, is for founders to write a memo. Take a Notion document, write a 2 to 3 page memo about what do you see as what you're trying to build, and be extremely articulate about it. Don't worry about the fact that the investor will not take time to read a 3-page document. You are going to qualify the investor for interest in travel anyways at the top of the funnel. So you are going to be speaking only with people who are interested in travel. And if they are interested in travel, then they will take that 15 minutes that they need to be able to read that memo. So I would highly recommend that if you don't have data to back up what you're claiming, then explain in words how exactly do you see this? Not a PPT, not a deck, none of that. Just simple, plain English language where you write blocks of text that explains what exactly is it that you're trying to achieve and why does that make sense in the world that we're trying to live in. The second thing is a repetition on my first point, which is that if you are raising right now in these problematic sectors, then when you start having these conversations, put a qualifier saying, listen, are you investing in this segment if everything works out, will you be willing, do you have the conviction and the certainty to write a check in this segment, or would you be wanting to wait until things are more clearer in terms of the external ecosystem around us? And get that answer from them. And even though it's an uncomfortable question to ask because you're pushing them to be candid with you, I think there are certain specific ways and tricks that you can use where you disarm them, so to speak, and ensure that they feel comfortable enough in sharing the fact that, listen, I think it's unlikely that we will be able to, it'll be an easy yes from us, right? It's not a space that we're actively investing in right now. So do these two things, because it's not going to be the easiest, most straightforward process at this point in time. I think assuming otherwise is not a very intelligent thing to do. And so, optimize for time and optimize for people that really care. And if they care, then they will read what you want them to read about. So write a memo and share that over email before the call. And that's the way to sort of get them excited and want to have that conversation with you.
Awesome. Mike, would it be okay if I selfishly, if I go one layer deeper on that?
Certainly.
Cool. So, okay. So look, there's a lot of sort of talk about like the process in which to fundraise, right? Just typically you're getting those warm introductions from fellow founders that have raised, right? So it's like, if I wanted to talk to FJ or anyone on there, like you'd be a great person to sort of reach out to. You sort of show like, hey, this is that we're executing, this is our thesis. And then you ask for that introduction. But in this point, like, I'd love for you to really like talk about like how to tackle and block when it comes to pre-qualifying, right? Because I think there's sort of a step there, a gap there that really is like, like you've worked all of this time to identify who you want. You then got the introduction, and then how do you actually go about doing that qualifying piece? That's the best way I can learn. So thanks, man.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The way I can imagine sort of solving for it right now is that when you are asking for the introduction, I would kind of pose an introduction with that qualifier saying that, hey, listen, I have got this amazing founder and I know he is in the space, which I know is not the most interesting or hot sort of, in terms of the environment around it. But are you actively looking at this space? Do you have a thesis in that space? Do you believe that now is a good time to sort of enter? And I would do that ask for somebody that I know really well, right? To get that warm introduction. And even if I do get a yes, will I sort of make the introduction? So I think it's okay for you to ask the person that you're asking for an introduction, saying, could you do this qualification for me? Because only if they're interested will it make sense for them and for me, right? So you're trying to not just worry about your time, but you're also worrying about the time of the investor, right? So I think that one is that. The second is, even if you can't do this, and if you do get them on a call or on an email thread or whatever it might be, there are subtle ways in which you say, hey, listen, I'm chatting with investors who have a tremendous amount of conviction in travel at this point in time. Would love to see if you believe in that same thesis, and would you be available to have a quick chat about this? And if you sort of pose that question in that email, I think it's quite likely that they'll come back to you with some indication, even if it may not be a very precise one, about where they are in terms of their thinking. And what you can then do is, if you're running a process, you will just need to stack rank these conversations. And so everybody that you don't have a great visibility in terms of whether their conviction levels are high or low, you would just sort of put them in the unknown bucket, and you would always put their calls in the second half of your list, so that you can finish the one that really mattered first and then get to this list a little later. So I would just sort of, prioritize or sequence my conversations, knowing where their priorities sort of lie, depending on this qualifier that I put.
Amazing.
It's also, by the way, extremely easy to find if people have a contrarian view. I have always seen, especially investors, they love to brag about it. So if they are investing in travel at this point in time, you would find a tweet about it. So I would just also go in and check about what they're saying, because if they are serious about wanting to invest in travel, they would have put something out there as a tweet, as a reply to somebody else's conversation, etc., where they would have hinted at the fact that I think it's a good time to sort of look at this. I think this is like a great time to be building something here. So I think these are some ways in which I would at least try and get to the right audience as efficiently as possible.
Really appreciate it. Thanks, man.
Awesome. That's a great question, Levi. Yeah, then the answer certainly super helpful. So thanks there. Hey, Patty, do you want to jump on?
Yes. Hey guys, thanks so much. I apologize. There's construction going outside, so lots of noise, but I'll make this quick. Varun, loved listening to everything that you shared, specifically operationally. I mean, the IVR, that was like a big light bulb in my head as I'm disrupting a really antiquated space of pharmacy drug procurement. And we've got a lot of disruption there. And so that is huge. Thank you. So you know, that's where we are. We're early stage. We just launched and we're doing some manual transactions now, really focusing on quality and the supply side. So again, a lot of the things that you mentioned really resonated. Now it sounded like you focused a lot on quality and really just doing everything possible to get the supply side figured out. And you also talked about the metrics, that you had really great metrics at the beginning when you raised. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because the balance is hard. How do you focus quality on suppliers and also show ginormous numbers for investors? Can you dive into that a bit?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The way that we position ourselves was that we were very clear to investors about the fact that our supply numbers will never be a rocket ship, right? That's not the intention behind this marketplace. This marketplace is about actively sort of taking the noise out and creating a seamless solution for the customer problem statement that there is. So our numbers were always about the stickiness of the supply side, the additional revenue, and the take rates that we were getting from supply side, but the growth was always a demand-facing number in terms of transactions, number of customers, and so on and so forth, right? So we created that differentiation and that expectation setting very clearly upfront. Having said that, what we also did sort of see, and the reason why we really obsessed over supply was that we found having perfect supply was the easiest way to get demand going. And I'll explain how this works. Maybe I'll just take a couple of minutes to sort of just dig deeper into this. When we had great supply, we were able to convert better. If we were converting better, we were making good money on the paid marketing that we were doing. We were able to take that money and put it back into marketing, which again got us more customers. With more customers, we were able to increase our take rate. So our margins increased. Our margins increased, which means that we were making even more money. We were able to take that even that higher sums of money back into marketing, and we kept repeating this on a loop, right? So the trick for us was that how do we get to a stage where our supply is so good that we are converting so highly that we're making money on the first few transactions that happen on the platform itself. And if you get to that stage, then if you have a system where the customer pays you and you're paying the supplier much later, so you have float that's sitting with you because you're paying the supplier 30 days out. And so you can use that cash, plus you can use the money that you have made, put it back into marketing and grow very, very quickly without having to use a lot of capital, right? I mean, between 2019 and the start of the pandemic, we would have spent approximately about 27 million on Google ads all over the world, right? Almost none of this was from the investor money that we had raised. All of this was money that we could just recycle because we had positive unit economics, which we were then able to sort of use to put it back into marketing. And because we were sitting on a float, we could just keep doing this day in and day out. So we really worked hard to get to that stage where conversions were high enough, where our unit economics were positive. And once we reached that stage, we could just spin the flywheel faster and faster and keep doing more of the same. But I think the trick to us was, how do we get a product and supply that's really good enough to be able to have conversions which are high enough to be able to have, unit economics which are positive. That was kind of like the sequence that we went about.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Super helpful.
Awesome. No, that's a great question. Yeah, that's super interesting to learn more about the float on that. So cool. Hey, Fitz, did you want to jump on for a last question here?
Yep. Hi, Varun. Thank you. This has been an awesome conversation. I wanted to rewind all the way to the beginning. when you were discussing the first 3 months of doing customer research and emailing 50 to 65 people a day for 3 months. I'm kind of in that process right now of better defining the problem and then kind of figuring out a timeline for when to start building. So I'm just curious to hear what did the effort that what did that effort lead to for you in those first 3 months? And I know you had said you had started to build the software that scraped their Google Sheets and Excel files. But was that kind of the first build that ultimately led to you getting insights into their inventory? Or like, how did it look that first 3 months, and then what came out of it?
That's a good question. And I'm going to preface my answer with a disclaimer that my answer is tinged by my own experiences, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, but this is what I believe in. I strongly believe that you should not be spending more than a few weeks at max in customer research and development, right? I think you should build as quickly as possible, right? Even if what you're building is incorrect, the fact that you're building will give you the impetus that you need to be able to take whatever little that you've built to the market and understand what's the resonance that you're getting for what you have built. To come back to our specific example, when we were reaching out to these people, sending 60, 65 emails a day, we were building product in parallel. We in fact had something available with us to showcase to them, right? And when we used to send those emails, we used to create accounts for them by default and said, listen, your account has already been created. Here's a link. So now what you see with Slack, which is a magic link where you create an account, we used to do that for them, right? So we used to say, hey, listen, just click on this account. And if you click on this link, with your email address, there's already an account that's created. All you have to do is just add a password and your account is good to go, right? So we had a running product. And that was important for them to be able to get into it, to just get a sense of what the hell is going on, right? Is this something that I'm even interested in? Is this better than just a random person that's cold emailing me for something that they might need? Or is it something that's a legit product that I can sink my teeth into? So I think for us, having that product available with us when we were doing that initial set of outreach really made a ton of difference. Also, the fact that we were building a product gave us impetus to do more of this, because otherwise we felt like we were wasting our time in building what we were building. So it acted as a forcing function for us to have to go out and get people to use it, because what's the point of doing all of this if we don't have people who will use it, right? So I think I kind of end up I feel like often in a generic sense, people end up not building because it's an excuse to not find out if what they have built is incorrect. And you're delaying the inevitable, because more often than not, what you build upfront will be incorrect. And it needs a little bit of love and a little bit of iteration from there. So my very biased recommendation would be to not obsess overtly about what customers want. Have a point of view, build something, go to them, and then learn from there. But you don't need a tremendous amount of information from them to decide what it is that you need to build. I think you can start with your own gut as a founder. I think oftentimes people take too much time to get to that stage, and I would recommend against that, with that disclaimer that I could be wrong.
Great, very helpful. Thank you, Varun.
Of course.
Awesome, thanks. So we're almost out of time here, but Varun, this is a really great chat. And you have some pretty incredible experience, building Headout and scaling it to where it's at today. So I did want to ask, do you have any kind of like tips that you like to share with us, maybe for early stage marketplace founders before we wrap things up?
So I actually was thinking about this before our chat as well. And I've got about 5 things that I want to share based on my experiences. I think the first thing, which is a mistake that we made for the first 2 years, was that we tried to solve the easier problems first. We tried to do the low-hanging fruits first. And in a marketplace, I feel like that's a recipe for disaster. I think you should pick the hardest, most friction-filled problem statement there is that's plaguing your marketplace and solve for that first and everything else later. So I would suggest that for marketplace founders, one should always flip the whole equation on its head and look for what's the most complicated, most complex, most annoying problem statement and solve for that first. Second, and this is a repetition of the kind of discussions that we talked about earlier as well, where I would always recommend founders to nail the supply and the product experience. And if you do nail that, then demand exists as long as the market that you're operating for has a large enough TAM and is a problem statement that affects a good number of people. If your solution works, they will come to you. I'm not saying that you don't have to solve for distribution. Of course you do, but solving for distribution without having this core proposition sorted is a very inefficient way to build things. Third would be, and this is not obvious, but one of the issues that I faced was that when we were trying to increase sales on Headout, we used to always try and figure out what's the best way to reduce pricing, right? We felt like if we were able to provide the same experience at a lower price point, customers would buy with us more, and that would give us the growth that we're looking for. We could not have been more wrong. And here's why. When we were trying to reduce prices, if the price reduction was a function of an actual fundamental change that we did to the supply stack, which led to efficiencies, which then led to a price reduction, that's great, not a problem. But if you're reducing price in the form of discounts and coupon codes and things like that, you are essentially limiting your take rate or your margin, right? And what that did for us, and I think what that does for a lot of marketplaces, is that when you don't have that margin, you aren't able to make money off of the marketing spends that you are accruing. And if you don't have that, then growth in itself becomes a very expensive proposition, and you are almost limited to grow with the capital that you have available with you, which is not a great place to be in for obvious reasons. So I think it's not intuitive, but I think people should experiment, marketplace founders should experiment with not discounting or not reducing pricing, having healthy take rates or having healthy margins, and figuring out ways to use the healthy margins to make good money, to be able to use that money to again reinvest it back in marketing, which is then a good way to grow. Because if you have more money to put into marketing, you can increase your top of the funnel, you can get more customers through the door, and you can increase your sales, your orders, or whatever KPI that you're tracking, right? But if you don't have that positive loop, then growth becomes problematic. The first few months will look great, but your bottom line will not support that growth. And at some point in time, your growth will then become slower and slower because you need to put more and more capital to be able to sort of grow. And that's not an ideal position to be in, right? So I think don't default to discounting is like a huge takeaway that I would share from our experience, because we did that for the first 2 years, and it was one of the dumbest things that we have done in running Headout. The last thing would be that I think marketplaces today have the scope to be more full stack in nature, because the problem statements that we have are not limited to just matchmaking, but are of a deeper nature, where the fundamental unit of the experience or the supply needs to be altered or reimagined. So I would encourage marketplace founders to think about the entire stack, everything from the way that supply is set up to the way that customer fulfills their wants, their desires, their needs, and see how you can create a marketplace which captures more of that stack. Because with capital available in abundance today, it's getting easier and easier to disrupt when you just have the basic aggregation layer. But if you've got a deeper layer where you've got this entire stack which you own, which is like proprietary to you in terms of the complexity of the tasks that you've taken on board, it's much harder to disrupt you, and it's a significantly better moat. So I would encourage marketplace founders to think of full stack as a way to build moats, because capital today is just too easily available for demand or basic supply to just be the only thing that you can rely on.
That's great. That's definitely a great way to wrap up the chat. And I'm gonna have to make a highlight clip of that and share it in the group after. So, well, cool. Well, this is a really incredible chat, and yeah, I really appreciate taking the time to join us and share all of your awesome experience and insights with us. So, last but not least, before we just wrap things up, time for a quick plug. Where can we keep up with you at?
Twitter at Varun Khona.
Awesome. You'll get a lot of new followers because I know you have a lot of fans here in the community. So thanks again for taking the time to join us. So this is really great. And thanks everyone for the great questions. So
thank you so much for having me. And thank you everybody for taking the time out and listening. I hope this was useful in some ways at least. And looking forward to chatting with all of you guys and getting to know each one of you.
It was amazing. And yeah, once again, congrats on the recent round and all the amazing work of where you're at today. So
thank you so much.
Awesome. All right. Thanks everyone.